Hey everybody, what's up? Ehren here, QPC Canada. Hope you had a great weekend. It was a pretty exciting week last week in Parliament. On Monday, Alan Reyes, the orphan MP, used to be a Conservative, now he's an Independent, dropped an absolute bomb about the Governor General's expenses, $1,800 a month on dry cleaning for years, 3 outfits a day, 7 days a week. But it was untouched by the media, so I find that strange. But we covered it. And then also, Greg Fergus, the new House Speaker, is a disaster. He's getting in the way of everything out there, and it's very disruptive on the floor. And I think that there's going to be some fallout this week based on that. Anyhow, we're going to jump right into question period and see how exciting it was today. So we'll jump right into oral questions. Here we go.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Pierre Poilievre, in the batter's box.
After 8 years of this Prime Minister, housing has doubled in cost, and now CMHC has said that there has been a 63% increase in the number of Canadians that use alternative loans. They pay up to 15% in interest for these alternative mortgages. Will the Prime Minister finally change his inflationary ways so that the Bank of Canada can reduce interest rates so that Canadians can keep their houses?
I'm worried about my house. I'm not turning on my heat. I'm changing the orders I buy at the grocery store because I can't afford the old ones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague across the way
What do we have going on
claims that he and his party want to march towards prosperity, but that would be through austerity. Canadians know that all the Conservatives represent is to chop things up. Chop, 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 Mr. Speaker. Chopping funding for small craft ports. Chopping in various programs that our communities need. The Conservative Party is like being a shark that claims to be vegetarian. They're not credible at all. They are not worth the risk, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are already living through austerity. They have to chop, chop, chop their own personal budgets, groceries, gas, and now their homes. There's now a new phenomenon. Seniors, middle-class seniors, find themselves homeless after the doubling of housing costs. A man in Calgary saw a $1,600 increase in his housing costs, and now he cannot find a place to rent. Will the government finally change its mind so we can reduce interest rates so that our seniors can keep a roof over their heads?
It's bad for the seniors, man.
The Honourable Minister.
If you're on a pension with
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Come on.
I was saying, Mr. Speaker, I'm sad to announce that on the other side of the House, they seem to have a cracked crystal ball. They want to cut everywhere. They're even cutting into their crystal balls now. They have no plan. They have no vision, Mr. Speaker.
She has a lot to say, huh?
And so, please ask them to fix their crystal balls so that they can better see in the future. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing, which has doubled. Now we see that there's been a 63% increase in the number of Canadians who are going to alternative lenders to get mortgages because they can no longer get approved by the main banks. That means interest rates as high as 15% per year. We haven't seen those types of rates since the last Trudeau was in power. Will the Prime Minister reverse his inflationary spending in the upcoming fall economic update so we can bring down interest rates and our Canadian people can keep their homes?
We need to get the interest rates down. It's important. Hopefully we can do that before we negotiate more mortgage.
Mr. Speaker, it's important that you understand that the honourable member's plan to actually have more homes built seems to be to cut funding to build those homes. I was in Brampton last week where we announced $114 million that's going to help Brampton build more than 24,000 homes over the next decade. He plans to cut it. When it comes to getting more homes built, we're removing the GST on new apartments in this country. He plans to put it back on. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to make the investments necessary. We agree that there are people struggling. The difference between us is we have a solution to the problem.
The Liberals seem like their patience has been tested early in this already.
Absolutely right that he has a problem that he and his government created. After 8 years, this Prime Minister has doubled rent, doubled mortgage payments, and now his plan is a $4 billion program that 2 years in has not built a single solitary home, and he wants to target tax benefits for the construction of $10 million penthouse apartments. Will they instead reverse their inflationary spending so we can bring down interest rates and let Canadians keep their homes?
He's got to watch his step when he's talking about housing, though. His track record.
Mr. Speaker, you want to talk about housing program delivery? When he was the minister, he had $300 million go towards the building of only 99 homes over years, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to roll out programs that are literally changing the ways that cities build homes. We have helped build or repair nearly 500,000 homes through the National Housing Strategy, which his party voted against. He's now opposing measures that's going to make it cheaper to build the homes that Canadians need. We're going to get it done by continuing to incentivize home building, supporting the people who are going to put roofs over the heads of our neighbors. It's the right thing to do. It's a shame that he opposes it.
I don't know if the plan that they've got is a good one. Do you? What do you think?
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, the National Housing Strategy of which he speaks has doubled housing costs. It doubled the cost of mortgages, rent, and down payments. And yes, it costs many billions more than what we spent when we were in government, but we delivered housing that was half the cost of what it is today. Now on to restaurants. Today we learned that 1/3 of restaurants are losing money. That leaves them three choices: shut down, cut wages, or raise prices on Canadians. Will the government reverse the carbon taxes and the inflationary increases to interest rates that are forcing our restaurants to go under and costing waitresses and servers their jobs?
Tough times, guys. Financially, it's tough out there.
Mr. Speaker, as a former small business owner myself, I know that small businesses are the backbone of these communities. And as a small business owner, I'm glad the Conservatives are not in charge. Small businesses wouldn't be saving $1 billion in credit card transaction fees. Women entrepreneurs would not have $7 billion of investment through our women entrepreneurship strategy, nor the $10 a day childcare that has put more women into the workforce. Conservatives have been voting against these efforts to support small businesses, including women entrepreneurs, and they are not worth the risk.
What do they have to say about that?
The Honourable Member for La Prairie.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker, 250,000 businesses risk going out of business as early as 2024 if the government does not postpone repayment of the emergency account loans. Imagine the impact if we were to lose 250,000 businesses at the same time. So it's not surprising that on Friday all the premiers of Quebec and other provinces wrote to this government. They demanded a 1-year postponement of the repayment deadline for our businesses without losing the non-repayable part. The premiers are unanimous. The premiers are responsible. Will the government respect their request?
We can't lose any more businesses. Like, after COVID,
The Honourable Minister.
recovery's been challenging,
Monsieur
right?
le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we offer extra flexibility for small businesses to repay their loans, which includes a full 1-year extension, more flexibility for repayment modalities, which constitutes an approach that is balanced and fiscally responsible. We continue to listen to small businesses throughout the country. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, once again, this government can't see beyond the end of its nose. That's not what businesses are asking for. They're asking for a 1-year extension for their loans. Does the government really think that these businesses will pay their loans back any faster? If these businesses close, how many workers will end up on EI? Has the government calculated that? Mr. Speaker, the premiers of Quebec and the provinces are unanimous. They have all understood that we have no choice. When will this government finally understand that this is completely logical?
And they say they're investing in Canadians. I don't know if I feel invested in.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. And as he knows full well, most businesses have said if our government hadn't been there during the pandemic, many businesses would have had to close their doors. We had a solution, a flexible solution that meets our fiscal framework and will continue to be here for businesses on many affairs. We have made historic investments in businesses in Quebec and will continue to do so.
All that
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
All right,
Israeli
what do you guys
families
think of
have lived with the
Jagmeet?
pain of loved ones either killed or still held hostage. In the last 2 weeks, the situation in Gaza has grown dire. Humanitarian aid is trickling in. Thousands have been killed, many children. Diverse voices are calling for a ceasefire, including the head of the UN, Canadian aid agencies, and even some Liberal MPs. Will the Prime Minister join the NDP's call for a ceasefire now?
I don't know if the terrorists will listen.
The deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza was dire before these last weeks. We are doing everything that we can to support Canadians on the ground. We're also committed to working diplomatically to prevent the conflict from spreading. We're working with our allies to ensure the protection of all Israeli and Palestinian civilians. We're calling and have been consistently calling on international humanitarian law to be respected. We were the first government to move to provide substantial humanitarian aid to both Israeli and Palestinian civilians, and we will continue our efforts in that regard.
L'honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
It's very subdued.
Is attacked.
Hamas terrorist attacks continue. Rockets are being sent on civilians. And
crazy
in
over
Gaza, the humanitarian situation is getting worse and worse.
Bad situation there.
More
too.
Israelis and Palestinians are losing their lives in this horrible war. When will the government finally take its role seriously in protecting innocents? And when will it finally ask for a ceasefire?
Like and subscribe, guys. Might as well get some likes
The
out there.
Honourable
Appreciate
Minister
it.
for International Development.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Active from the very beginning, we were the first Western country to provide an initial amount of $10 million to go to humanitarian assistance. And recently, we announced an additional $50 million, Mr. Speaker, bringing the Canadian total to $60 million. We've been consistent in the call to respect international humanitarian law by all parties in this conflict, and we've been consistently working very hard with our friends and allies in the region to make sure that the humanitarian corridors are not only open, but that they're maintained and that essential life-saving supplies get through on a daily basis. Merci.
He's so calm. Resting
député de
pulse is
Thornhill.
probably
Mr. Speaker,
40.
after 8 years of this Liberal
right, well, it's
NDP government,
Lansman's
nearly
fun.
half of all Canadians with a mortgage
Sharp
say that
dressed.
they're having a
She's
tough
well-dressed
time
today.
paying it.
Always.
The Prime Minister told us interest rates would stay low forever, but his reckless spending and higher taxes have caused rates to skyrocket faster than ever. Now struggling families are paying the price. Young people can't even imagine getting in. There is a mortgage crisis on the horizon until this Prime Minister reins it in. When will he stop the inflationary deficits and balance the budget so that Canadians can keep their homes?
What do you guys think of Melissa Lansman? She's a firecracker. She doesn't mess
L'honorable
around.
ministre du Logement.
Mr. Speaker, when I hear the
Sean is fun
Conservatives
watching
make
you.
arguments that we should be spending less in the context of housing, I would point out to them that it takes investments to build the housing necessary to put a roof over the same Canadians' heads that she seems concerned about. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, we're cutting the tax on new apartment construction in this country. They want to put it back on. We are moving forward with a plan to fund cities so they build more homes. They plan to cut it. When we put measures on the floor of the House of Commons to support some of society's most vulnerable, they vote against it. Every step of the way they try to block progress for people, we're going to advance it at all costs.
What do you guys think of Sean? Sexy Sean Fraser. He's a Nova Scotian boy. I'm from Nova
L'honorable
Scotia.
député de Thornhill.
Well, that That's
Shout
false,
out.
Mr.
Oh,
Speaker.
she's
They
fine.
act like everything's okay. They haven't built a single home with their accelerator fund. But the number of people who are paying their mortgage, the number of people who say that they're paying their mortgage is very difficult, has doubled in 6 months. And as mortgage payments and anxiety go up, Canadians cut back on essentials like food and home heating. Mr. Speaker, you shouldn't have to choose between heating your home and putting food on the table, but that's the reality after 8 years of this Prime Minister. Canadians are realizing that he's not worth the cost. Will this minister finally realize that too?
It's true. My cats are cold today because I wasn't able to turn on the heat because I can't afford to. Yet, not yet. I know that I will have to eventually.
Mr. Speaker, part of the reasons it's difficult to find affordable housing in this country is because for 30 years, federal governments in Canada failed to make the investments necessary, including the previous Conservative government. When they were last in power, Mr. Speaker, this country lost 800,000 homes that were on the market at affordable prices. We're going to continue to make the investments necessary to get more homes built. I would ask the honourable member in response to her question why she wants to raise taxes on home building and cut funding for home builders. Mr. Speaker, we need to make the investments necessary to build homes in this country, and that is exactly what we're going to do.
Once again, I'll ask all members, even those who are not sitting in their normal seats, to please listen to the response, and when they have the floor, they'll be able to ask the questions. The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, spending is out of control and inflationary deficit are pushing up mortgage costs. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says the deficit this year will increase to over $46 billion. And everyone now agrees that spending is driving interest rates. Every month, 70,000 households are renewing their mortgage, and they're realizing that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So will they rein in inflationary deficits, put forth a plan to balance the budget so Canadians can keep their homes?
I love the way that they stare at the speaker or who it is that they're trying to address. Like,
Mr. Speaker, I can speak to the fact that Canada's created over 1 million more jobs compared to pre-pandemic levels, has the lowest debt to GDP ratio and the lowest deficit in the G7, lower inflation than our comparative partners around the world, and the IMF and OECD project the strongest growth in 2024. We know that Canadians are struggling right now, but the real difference between us and the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, is that our government will not abandon people in need, like the Conservative leader has made abundantly clear time and time again.
L'honorable député de Simcoe Nord.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the government hasn't got the memo. Nobody cares about meaningless G7 comparative statistics. After 8 years of prolific spending, the bills are finally coming due. The government borrowing is driving interest rates. This year, the government has to borrow $421 billion. Next year, the government has to borrow over $350 billion. That pushes up mortgage costs for everybody. So once again, will they acknowledge that they need to rein in their spending, produce a plan to balance the budget so that Canadians can keep their homes?
Got to bring it in. Balance that budget. Reduce the spending. Do something about those inflationary issues, interest rates.
L'honorable ministre.
My cats are cool.
Mr. Speaker, I will share with you what Canadians and Albertans care about, and that is the Canada Pension Plan. And Mr. Speaker, after 3 weeks of silence on behalf of the Conservative leader, finally a comment on Daniel Smith's idea to take Albertans out of the CPP, a weak, timid response at that. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? 30 MPs from Alberta, Conservatives, every one of them, silent on the issue. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because they talk a big game in this House, but when it comes to defending Albertans and Canadians, they're silent. We're on the task. We're going to defend Albertans and the CPP.
Where did we go?
That's
Greg messing around. That's Greg messing
Speaker,
around
after
again.
8 years of this Liberal government,
Mr. Speaker.
Unfortunately, we no longer recognise the Canada we were so proud of, because rent is twice as much as before. More and more people are now forced to live where? In their cars.
Gerard de Hell is pretty fun too.
Mr. Speaker, in Canada, a G7 country, people living in a car, that makes no sense. But the Liberals' brilliant idea, supported by the Bloc Québécois' radical ideas, is to invent a new tax on carbon. That's not even a joke. Is there anyone in this government who thinks this finally makes no sense?
He'll get back up and he's going to be more fired up next time, I bet.
The Honourable
He usually
Minister.
gets fired up, so intense.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. Many things in his question, but I'd like to start by saying that climate change isn't just taking care of the environment. That's what the Conservatives don't want to do in the first place, but it's also taking care of our transition economy. Fighting for climate change is creating jobs, and that is exactly what we're doing on this side of the House.
Do you believe that?
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent.
Climate change is creating jobs?
Well, she should go and knock on people's car windows and tell them that. It's completely disconnected from reality. People who are living this government's inflationary crisis, for 8 years, they did nothing to control spending. They created inflationary measures, and so today, everything costs far too much. What do they want to do is radically increase the carbon tax with the complicit help from the Bloc Québécois. Is there anyone in this government who can finally rise up and say that this finally makes no sense?
Oh man, he's one of my favorites. I'm a pretty big fan. He's so animated, so intense.
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I would like to say, very seriously, is that the Conservatives voted against all measures that support families, the Canada Childcare Benefit, investments that we made in housing. We're still waiting on a vote on C-56 that will allow us to control grocery prices, tax credits for more housing. On this side of the House, we are taking care of people every single day. The Honourable Member.
Do you feel like you're being
Saint-Jean.
taken care of by your current
Mr.
government?
Speaker, Israel has the
federal
right to
government?
defend itself. We have to be realistic. The conflict in Gaza is not going to subside in the short term. We must also be realistic about the inadequacy of the humanitarian aid that is trickling in at the moment. Canada must ask Israel for a humanitarian truce until aid can reach the civilians in need. The UN made a request to this effect last week. The European Union is currently evaluating it. Will Canada support this idea of a humanitarian truce?
It's a nice thought.
The Honourable Minister for International Development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's our collective duty to defend humanity, dignity, and the protection of all. We are firm on our position before this humanitarian crisis. Innocent civilians need more help, not less. That is the reason for which we announced a total care package of $60 million to meet the needs of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in adjacent regions. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Well, the humanitarian aid has to get there in the first place. Everyone would prefer peace to war. But it would not be realistic to ask Israel for a complete ceasefire while its population is not safe. On the other hand, it would be realistic for Canada to support the United Nations' more nuanced request. What we are talking about here is a temporary multilateral and humanitarian truce, a truce to get food supplies through, to protect humanitarian corridors, to protect aid distribution areas where NGOs will be safe. It's a reasonable proposal, Mr. Speaker. Will Canada support a humanitarian truce?
It's so sad what's happening over there.
We would like to remind everyone
in Gaza
about why humanitarian corridors have to remain open, unencumbered, so that humanitarian assistance can rapidly reach those who need it the most. We have been encouraged by the presence of the second humanitarian convoy that went over the Rafah border crossing. We ask that this continue unencumbered, so that humanitarian assistance can reach those who need it. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. That wasn't really clear. Was that yes or no? Anyway, we'll speak after question period. Since the horrific and tragic events of the 7th of October, there has been growing hatred in Canada and Quebec between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine groups. hateful graffiti, swastikas, repeated intimidation of people of the Jewish or Muslim faiths. It is as if we wanted to transpose here in Quebec and Canada the war, hatred, and division that are unfortunately taking part in the Middle East. As if we needed more division on this issue here. Will the Prime Minister appeal for calm before a tragedy occurs, as was the case in the States or in France?
See what he says to that.
The Honourable Minister.
Oh no,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Karina
I'd
Gould,
like to
the most
thank my
boring clown in
honourable
the
colleague
building.
for that very important question. This is something that everyone is concerned with at the moment. There is no place for speech or violence here in Canada. We know that Jewish and Muslim, Israeli and Palestinian communities are hurting right now. They are scared, and we should all work together because, first and foremost, we're Canadians, and we should be here for everyone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Then I have Deputy
She's
King
so
Vaughan.
boring, guys.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Prime Minister's high inflationary deficit and punishing tax hikes, seniors are being forced out of their homes and onto the streets. John, a senior, had a monthly mortgage payment of $1,000, but today it ballooned to $2,600. He was forced to sell his home. But with rent increases, he can't find an affordable apartment. He will soon find himself homeless. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Has he finally learned that the budget doesn't balance itself?
Imagine thinking that a balance just naturally, a budget balances itself.
Then I
naturally.
have Ministre.
Mr. Speaker, it's fascinating that the honourable member will ask a question about seniors trying to find a place that they can afford when her party put forward a housing plan that mentions seniors precisely 0 times. Mr. Speaker, over the course of my time in this chamber, I have seen the Conservatives oppose taking the age of retirement from 67 back to 65. I have seen them oppose increases to the guaranteed income supplement. I have seen them oppose increases to the old age security pension to go up for seniors 75 and more. If it's finally time that the Conservatives recognize seniors need help, I welcome it, but they're new to this game, Mr. Speaker.
Oh my. Spitting venom right there.
And I have
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Échemins-Lévis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The carbon tax, which raises the price of everything and which the Bloc wants to increase radically, is making Quebecers poorer. After 8 years of this government, a young retiree has to go back to work to pay for her heating and grocery bills.
Do you see how many seniors are working
She says,
retail?
all my bills are higher.
Great.
It's expensive to vote for the Bloc Québécois. The Prime Minister must finally understand that his inflationary policies are hurting people. When will he abandon his costly carbon tax, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister for the Environment. Mr. Speaker, you know, sometimes people watching us develop a certain cynicism when it comes to politics. And it's when we hear this kind of rhetoric from the member on the other side, who was a member of a provincial government, that was the first in North America that created a carbon tax. She fought for a carbon tax, not only in Quebec, but around the world. And all of a sudden, the weather vane shifts to the other side, which creates a lot of cynicism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is a lot of cynicism and skepticism out there these days. People are frustrated, right?
To the Honourable Member, I would like to encourage
Sit
those
down.
who have already asked questions to allow other people to speak. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Échemins-Lévis.
He looks pleasant and seems like a nice guy,
Here
but
we
he's
are
a pain in the
our
ass, guys.
great Canada. Retired seniors have to go back to work to be able to pay for their basic needs, like food and heat. It's shameful. That's the reality after 8 years of this Liberal government supported by the Bloc Québécois. Quebec is a province most affected by inflation for the 4th month in a row. It's expensive to vote for the Bloc Québécois. When will the Prime Minister cancel his disastrous carbon tax, which radically increases the price of absolutely everything, Mr. Speaker?
She's intense, man. It's almost like she's staring
Honourable
out
Minister.
into the abyss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that it's difficult to call Jean Charest a dangerous bloquiste. It's under that premier that she created and defended the carbon tax. She believed in climate change. Now she no longer believes in it. She believed in carbon pricing. She believed in implementing programs to support public transit for the electrification of transit. Now she believes in nothing. just because she's part of a ideologically opposed party to climate change.
It's interesting.
L'honorable député de Vancouver-Est.
The Auditor General has reinforced findings from two Poilievre reports of racist outcomes in Canada's immigration system. Regional disparities continue to create longer processing times for those in sub-Saharan Africa. Meanwhile, new AI tools discriminately double wait times for Haitian citizens. The Liberals said they will address regional disparities in 2016, but the Auditor General found they have done nothing. This is outrageous. People's lives are hanging in the balance. Will the government take immediate action to put in place an independent ombudsperson to end the systemic racism in IRCC?
It is a good question, too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it is important not to deny the reality that systemic racism exists within IRCC, as well as the fact that it exists throughout the public service, and we need to address it. This has real impacts on people that are looking to come to Canada, as well as some of the facts that the member opposite has stated. I would note that, thankfully, the Auditor General produced a report that will help as a guide. I've asked my Deputy Minister to continue her work in fighting systemic racism. I would also note that some of the thresholds have gone up in Western Africa since the reference point, but it's not enough, and we've got to do better.
That's a weird one. It's not like to admit that.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must call for a ceasefire in Israel and Palestine now. We must protect children from injury, death, and the desolation of their futures. Canada's voice used to be a leader that stands up for human rights and dignity for all, not standing on the sidelines what we're seeing now. If Canada doesn't act, more families will mourn as the violence will escalate and already spilled into Lebanon and the region. And the government's lack of concern from Canadians trapped in Gaza is disturbing. Why won't the Prime Minister call for a ceasefire now? How hard is it to say the word ceasefire?
It is a little strange that they haven't called for it, right? Or it's strange,
Minister for International Development.
Western country to provide humanitarian assistance to all civilians in the region. On top of that, we topped up with an additional $50 million. And as a result of that early example, our friends and allies have been incentivized to follow our example. I just spoke to the German Minister for International Development, and she told me that this morning Germany announced $50 million to help civilians caught in this conflict. We are providing the leadership necessary to get aid flowing, to fight for the respect of international humanitarian law, and we're putting our money where our mouth is to get life-saving materials to civilians in the region.
Look at him. For him, that was what is going as you'll see.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are concerned about the cost of housing and finding a home at the price they can afford. While the leader of the opposition continues to blame municipal mayors and councillors, we are committed to work side by side with all levels of government to increase housing supply. Can the minister explain how he is working with the local government to build more homes in my community of Brampton?
Seems to be proud to be from Brampton.
For housing.
I want to thank my honourable colleague, not only for his question today, but for hosting myself and the Prime Minister last week, where we announced an investment of $114 million alongside Mayor Patrick Brown for the city of Brampton. This investment, importantly, Mr. Speaker, is going to fast-track the construction of more than 3,100 homes over the next 3 years and more than 24,000 over the next decade. Mr. Speaker, by working with municipal councils and identifying the most ambitious plans in the country, we're going to be able to solve Canada's national housing crisis, starting right in that members' community in the city of Brampton.
Interesting. What's going on in Brampton? Anybody know? Why do they need
30,000? After 8 years, farmers can no longer carry the burden of this NDP Liberal government. In a letter to the Prime Minister, vegetable farmers warn Canadians of why this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. The price of fresh vegetables is already up 12%, and the Liberals' front-of-pack warning labels on food will cost the industry $2 billion. Wow. But now the Prime Minister's nonsensical package changing on produce will increase the price of food 30%. Costs will be passed directly to the consumer. So why is the Prime Minister increasing the cost of food by 30%?
Another 30%? Come on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleague's question. And he's fully aware that we're dealing with the food
Poor
chain
Lawrence
in
got
order to
confused
deal
on
with
Friday.
the cost and price of food. And we understand the price of food is too high. But, Mr. Speaker, if we do not deal with climate change, that is a major problem with the cost of price of food. When you have floods in British Columbia, you have fires in British Columbia, you have straw worth $300 a bale across the prairie. There's no possibility of keeping food prices down when you have extreme weather conditions. We are and will continue to deal with climate change.
He did pretty good there. That's no paper, didn't get too hung up. Yeah, he really stalled on Friday. He had a
There is no chance of keeping food prices low if you keep adding red tape and bureaucracy and carbon taxes on farmers.
It's true.
Farmers can't afford increased carbon taxes and red tape, and neither can Canadians who are already struggling to put food on the table. The price of beef and fresh vegetables is up 12%. The carbon tax will cost Canadian farmers close to $1 billion by 2030. It's this simple. You increase costs on farmers, food goes up. You increase costs on retailers, food goes up. Why is this Prime Minister not worth the cost? Because he's increasing food by 30%. Exactly. Why?
Greg is just like this. I don't know.
Control
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We know that climate change has many times the impact on general and food inflation than the carbon price has. But you don't see Conservatives jumping up and down to raise ambitions on fighting climate change. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? When Canadians want more action on climate change, they're regressive and promote climate denial. Let me also clarify that the vast majority of low and middle income families get more money back than they pay through the quarterly rebate. So when Conservatives want to take away those payments, who are they actually advocating for?
Exactly.
Little sour look there.
Colleagues, member from Dufferin-Caledon, all colleagues, please. Let us keep our comments to the time that you have the microphone when you have the floor. The honourable member from Hastings, Lennox-Haddington.
Canada is an agricultural powerhouse. It is something that farmers of Eastern Ontario and across Canada are all very proud of. After 8 years, this Liberal NDP government's fanatical pursuit of failed, ideologically driven economic policy is crushing Canadian farmers, and too many families can't even afford nutrition food. The reality is, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So, Mr. Speaker, when will this morally and politically bankrupt government wake up and stop punishing farmers with inflation-inducing carbon tax?
Yeah. It's doing. Greg, come on, let them do their thing.
Mr. Speaker, if Conservatives really cared about grocery prices, then why aren't they supporting our Affordability Act in this House? They've stated repeatedly over and over again that they're going to vote against measures that will increase competition and bring down food prices for Canadians. Are they to expect us to believe that common sense means working against the interests of Canadians? We're fighting for affordability for Canadians every step of the way. The Conservatives should get on side and support our Affordability Act.
I don't know about this Affordability Act, guys. It sounds good. They always do.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, the government is punishing Canadians with its harmful tax. Canadians are having trouble feeding their families, and demand for food banks has shot up. For the 4th month in a row, Quebec is the most affected by inflation. That's what happens when the Bloc Liberal coalition is insisting on imposing a tax and wants to radically increase prices. It's expensive to vote for the Bloc. Will they cancel their infamous tax today?
I don't think they're going to be canceling that tax today.
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Right. It's unbelievable to see a colleague from Quebec refuse to believe in global warming. heating of the oceans, concerns in the fisheries sector, species at risk, tornadoes that destroyed our infrastructure along shorelines. They have no plan. They would cut all the plants. That's what the Conservatives are like.
Yeah, she's fun. yeah, she's having a good time with it.
Dear colleagues, please, if I could ask you once again not to speak before being recognized by the Speaker. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé.
Yeah, I got a feeling it's not going to last.
Mr. Speaker, last Saturday in
Miss
Quebec,
Anthony Rada.
organizations and unions protested to demand an end to closed work permits for temporary foreign workers and their right. Closed permits put workers in a state of total dependence on their employer, and unfortunately, some employers take advantage. The Bloc Québécois has finally succeeded in bringing this issue to committee. Can we count on the government to tell temporary foreign workers listening to us that we're working on solutions and that closed permits will soon be a thing of the past?
Too much government permits, regulations.
Mr. Speaker, I very much appreciate the question from my colleague. When it comes to temporary foreign workers, these are people who come here temporarily to work in agriculture and other very important sectors like tourism. It should be noted that the program we have now is not the program we saw under the Harper government. And when it comes to sectoral work permits, we have a system in place to protect workers, as well as requirements for businesses who have to obey them. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé.
I don't think that was a very good answer there.
We need
Randy
answers, Mr. Speaker.
Well.
Closed permits not only lead to abuse, but also to situations that just don't make sense. Radio Canada raised a good example. Mr. Bérard from Mauritius. He works in Beauce, and he wants to stay there, but the factory where he works is closing. Because he has a closed employer-specific permit, he can't look for a job except in another plant with the same company. Either he'll have to leave the region, or he'll have to leave Quebec because he's losing his job. Does the government not agree that we need to put an end to these situations that just don't make sense?
A lot of things aren't making sense.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, I appreciate the question from my colleague, and I'm very sympathetic to it. We have temporary foreign workers in Canada, and we have improved the quality of inspections. We're working with support organizations for migrant workers in the country. We've also opened up opportunities for people to access permanent residency. We're working on it.
Rick Perkins in the batter's box.
For 8 years, the Affordable Housing Association of Nova Scotia said that homelessness has gone up by 400% in Halifax since 2019 because the cost of everything has gone up, which has been caused by this NDP Liberal government. And even Atlantic Canada Liberal MPs agree the cost of living crisis is caused by the carbon tax. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost, and Canadians are suffering. When will the NDP Liberal government axe a carbon tax, so Canadians can keep their homes?
He's laying back. Maybe the next question he'll.
Mr. Speaker, you know, it's fascinating. I was with the head of the Affordable Housing Association for Nova Scotia just a couple of weeks ago when we were announcing a $79 million investment in Halifax. It's going to build more homes in that city. It happened to be on the location of an affordable housing project that only exists because it was funding through the federal government's National Housing Strategy. If the Honourable Member wants to address housing policy, I would suggest he talks to some of his colleagues who plan to raise taxes on home builders and cut funding for home building. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to make the investments necessary to put over the roof over the head of Canadians. I hope he gets with the times and joins us.
He's a dancing fool.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government driving up the cost of living in Atlantic Canada, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Liberal MPs from Atlantic Canada have again decided to punish us by quadrupling the carbon tax to 61 cents per litre. Atlantic Canadians have had enough of the carbon tax. Will the Prime Minister now admit the carbon tax is punishing Atlantic Canada and the most vulnerable people in our society?
reality.
That's it.
I kind of felt the carbon tax never made sense when they were rolling it out. It just...
Then I had
not the right way to deal with the issue.
Now is probably as good a time, specifically right now, to remind this House that just about every member on that side of the House ran, of course, on a carbon tax. They had some way of going about it where you would collect, to remind me if you could, green points that would go to some sort of government-run Amway catalog that you could collect for some sort of greeny things that would be selected by the government. I can only assume that members from that side of the House would form this government committee where you could cash in your points. And anyway, we prefer on this side of the House to put cash back into the pockets of hard-working Canadians. Mr. Speaker.
Well, that's the most fire I've seen him bring to the floor.
Then I have Deputy Debate Kunti.
Mr. Speaker, if RBC takes over HSBC, it'll mean that Canada's #1 bank will swallow up Canada's #7 bank and its 800,000 mortgage customers in one big gulp. What does that mean for Canadians? Well, this week's variable mortgage rates show that HSBC's variable mortgage rate is 6.4% compared to RBC at 7.15%.
That's a big difference.
That means for a family in Toronto or Vancouver with $500,000 mortgage will pay over $312 more per month over the $1,000 they're paying when they remortgage. Will this minister reject this merger, or will she prove once again that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost?
Yeah!
Then I have Secretary Parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance takes her role as regulator of the financial sector very seriously. As the Department of Finance stated on November 29th of last year, the Minister of Finance's decision on the acquisition will be informed by all required regulatory review processes, including those administered by the Office of Superintendent for Financial Institutions and the Competition Bureau. I want to assure everyone that our government is committed to supporting competition because we know competition is in the best interests of Canadians.
Then I have Deputy West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, international, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing causes severe harm to species such as wild Pacific salmon and the oceanic white-tip shark. It not only causes economic harm to the thousands that rely on the regulated fishing industry, it also further endangers at-risk species and impacts Indigenous communities that rely on certain fish stocks for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. Can the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard provide an update to this House on the critical work our government is doing to combat international illegal fishing?
The
Honourable Minister.
It's the first time that I've seen that.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his question and his strong advocacy for fish species at risk. This fall, Fisheries and Ocean Canada successfully led the first high seas patrol to detect and prevent illegal fishing in the North Pacific. This operation led to the seizure of over 3,000 illegally fished shark fins. Our message is clear. Canada will continue to fight illegal fishing by foreign actors both in Canada and abroad.
Deputy Brantford.
Mr. Speaker, the RCMP ended the SNC investigation due to this Prime Minister's refusal to gain access to cabinet documents. It doesn't stop there. During my recent inquiry with the Auditor General, the NDP Liberal Cover-Up Coalition adjourned the meeting, leaving crucial questions unanswered. Over the last 8 years, this Prime Minister has spent years concealing his role in the SNC scandal. He is not worth the cost. When will he finally produce the documents as requested by the RCMP?
I want to remind all members, please, to refrain from using mock names. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the RCMP have confirmed, there is no active investigation. The case was fully looked into and is now closed. And as the member opposite knows, all RCMP operations are taken independently.
Hear, hear. Then I have Deputy Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, that response is the opposite definition of transparency and accountability. In 2019, after being found guilty of breaching the Conflict of Interest Act, the Prime Minister claimed he took full responsibility for his mistakes. Yet here we are after 5 years, and the RCMP confirms that the Prime Minister refused to release all the documents as requested. Canadians have questions, and unlike this NDP Liberal cover-up coalition, Conservatives want answers. What is he hiding?
Good. He is fun, right? Brock is good. Very serious name and serious presence.
To the Honourable Minister, I do want to remind all honourable members once again to please refrain from using mock titles.
What is a mock title?
Minister for Justice and
I don't mean to sound like a dummy. I know
Mr.
what mock
Speaker,
is.
I appreciate that question, but I also appreciate who it's coming from. The member opposite is somebody who I've worked with in the past on the Justice Committee, somebody who knows the criminal justice system in this country and the difference between political operations and policing operations. There's a bright line in a democracy between those two things. In a democracy, we don't instruct police officers how to do their job. The RCMP conducted an independent investigation, concluded there was no further investigation merited. We trust the RCMP in this country to do their jobs independently. I wish my colleague opposite would do the same.
Arif is one of the best speakers the Liberals have.
Honourable Member of Parliament from Leeds Grenville, 1009 Vito Lakes.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, we see that these Liberals can't help but line the pockets of their friends. And this Prime Minister simply isn't worth the cost to Canadians. His green tech slush fund is being used to funnel money into the pockets of insiders. Now, the chair of the board is a friend of the Prime Minister. Annette Verscheren has received millions of dollars from the same fund for which she is chair. How many more Liberal insiders have gotten rich from this slush fund?
He's going like that. He goes for the drug dealer too. He's always scrappy.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I've said in this House numerous times now, when the Minister learned about the allegations of mismanagement at SDTC, he immediately acted to hire a third party to do an independent, impartial review that came back with a report. Those findings are now being turned into corrective actions, which are part of an implementation plan that SDTC is implementing by December.
Trouble
and let's
reading
make
the
one
script.
thing clear, Mr. Speaker. We expect the highest standards of governance from all of our federal agencies.
Good answer.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacoste. Mr. Speaker, Quebec's SMEs represent over 95% of the province's businesses, and they're still struggling. During the pandemic, our government was there to support them, helping to pay employees' salaries, offering rent assistance and emergency loans. Can the minister responsible for the Economic Development Agency for Quebec's regions tell us how CED is supporting our SMEs and actively participating in the economic recovery of all of Quebec's regions? The Honourable Minister.
I don't like when they tee each other up like this, especially when they do it from a script.
Our government knows that SMEs are still facing challenges. I'm proud that CEDs support them in every region of Quebec, including $212 million for more than 580 projects within the Regional Economic Growth through Innovation Program, $33 million in the Community Futures Program, which funds more than 50 CFDCs and 8 business development centers. We know that supporting economic development in our regions means supporting local jobs. Thank you.
I do want to get
Speaker,
to the bottom of what
the city of Coquitlam has had to foot the bill to save affordable homes because the federal government is missing in action. Renters in my community are being displaced at alarming rates as their homes are being sold off to for-profit developers. Homelessness in Coquitlam is soaring. We cannot afford to lose more co-ops and rentals. And the Liberals are turning their back on local governments who are doing their best to protect low-income renters. How many more people need to go homeless before they take this housing crisis seriously?
It is a good question. Rick said earlier that 400%
my honourable colleague for her
homelessness is up in
concern
Nova
regarding the
Scotia.
need to invest in affordable housing and to invest in homelessness prevention. I'd remind her that we had the opportunity not only to make an initial multi-billion-dollar investment to address homelessness in Canada, but then to double it. Shamefully, certain parties in this chamber voted against that measure. Mr. Speaker, this builds on 8 years of work where we have returned to the affordable housing space through the National Housing Strategy and now are working very closely with local governments, municipalities from coast to coast to coast, to build more homes. I look forward to doing that in cooperation with the NDP.
Tired now, all that dance.
The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska.
This is
Speaker,
Alan
everyone's
Reyes. He
talking
dropped the
about
bomb.
the urgent need to
This is
act
it.
on climate change and the energy transition. Citizens are being asked to take action. When it's time for them to be reimbursed for their portion of the Canadian grant for greener homes, that urgency falls by the wayside. The provincial portion is reimbursed within 2 months of filing documents. At the federal level, citizens have had to wait more than 18 months to get their money. It's almost impossible to talk to a public servant. When people get through, they're being told that staff is swamped. Mr. Speaker, at a time when citizens are struggling to make ends meet, can the minister just make sure his staff solves the problem once and for all? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for Richmond Arthabaska for his question. I recognize that there were problems with the program's implementation, but since then, Natural Resources Canada set up measures to improve access to the program so that people can renovate their homes, make them more energy friendly, and save money on their energy bills and reduce greenhouse gases, which the Conservatives opposed, and in fact they'd get rid of that program if they took power. We'll continue to work with all Canadians on climate change and affordability.
Changes in the air, I think.
That is the
Feels
end
like it,
of
right?
question period.
Canadians are
we
fed up.
have a point of order.
Been a while.
Point of order.
Oh my lord. Well. Guys. That came to an end very, very quickly. Kind of missed it there. That was a fun episode though. I don't know where Trudeau's been. He's not been in Parliament hardly at all the last couple of weeks, like maybe 1 or 2 days, maybe. It'll be interesting to see if they ever do follow up the story about the Governor General and how much money she was spending on dry cleaning. $1,800 a month. 3 outfits a day, 7 days a week for 4 years. It's ridiculous. But it's not being touched by the media. That's strange. Anyways, guys, we're going to wrap up for tonight. Thank you all for joining me. It's a lot of fun. I'm Ehren. This is Question Period Canada. Please send along any feedback that you'd have. I'm looking to improve, but I'm just here by myself, and sometimes you need feedback to have ideas. Like, I'm trying new things, trying to have fun with it, trying to get educated and be involved. But if you have any feedback, please send me a note. That'd be greatly appreciated. And before we go, just remember to like and subscribe. That's great. We are growing here, and that's all due to you guys. So I appreciate that very, very much. Have a wonderful evening. We'll catch you tomorrow. We'll be back. That's it. I really do appreciate hanging out with you guys, watching some of this Question Period Canada. It's a lot of fun. We'll catch you next time. Have a good night, guys.